Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share 4 disturbing Wendigo encounters I found on the internet. I've said that crawler encounters are some of the creepiest stories I come across, but Wendigo encounters are right up there with them. The mimicking of a familiar voice would have to be the most unsettling thing to hear while out in the middle of nowhere, especially knowing that the person you are supposedly hearing calling out to you isn't anywhere close to your current location. I know other cryptids can mimic too, but it is a behavior most associated with Wendigo, used to try and lure people into the woods. They are definitely sinister in nature. Alright, let's get to the first story. The first story of this episode comes from a poster who was unfortunate enough to have 2 encounters with what he believed were Wendigo. He has lived in Idaho his whole life and spent most of his childhood outdoors. His grandparents would take him camping, and he and his older brother would hike any and every trail they could find. It was during one hike when his first encounter with the unknown would take place. The original poster and his brother were on a camping trip and out hiking that evening, as they normally did. He says they were on a trail near a river he calls Warm River. He calls it this because it never freezes over. During their hike, the boys came across the tunnel that led through a mountain. The OP guessed it was an old train tunnel. They went into the tunnel, and about 2/3 of the way down, they heard an awful, spine-chilling scream echo through the tunnel from where they had entered. He has heard screams from just about every type of animal you could come across in that area, and he thinks even some Bigfoot calls, and knows nothing he has ever heard before can make that gut-wrenching, metallic, grating scream he heard that evening. It did not sound like any animal he had ever heard before. In fact, it did not even sound natural. The OP jumped where he stood, and his brother let out a string of curses before they quickly got out of that tunnel. They hurried back to camp, on edge the whole way. That night, he heard something moving around the campsite outside the trailer they were staying in, and heard whispers echoing in the darkness. He woke up his brother a few times, but he dismissed the sounds as other campers up late enjoying themselves. They had no further incidents during that trip. His next, much more terrifying encounter took place a few weeks later at an old ski lodge in Pine Basin that his family rented each year to have a family reunion. The OP and his cousins would play games outside at night. Hide and seek and a game he calls Ghosts in the Graveyard being their favorites. They were playing hide and seek on this night, and the OP was chosen as the seeker. Since he was one of the younger cousins, he was allowed to have a flashlight for the game. During their games, the younger cousins would normally hide near the lodge, while the older cousins ventured into the trees at the base of the nearby mountain. The OP was searching near the bottom of the mountain when he heard a familiar whistle not that far up the mountain. He thought it was one of his cousins, as they normally whistled during the game to give the others hints as to where they were hiding. The whistle came from behind a tree, so he started making his way toward it. He began feeling uneasy as he approached the tree, the feeling growing stronger with each step. He did not like being outside alone at night, but figured whoever he found behind the tree could walk him back to the lodge. He then noticed an unnatural silence had settled upon the woods and knew something was not right. Even where he was, you could always still hear the adults enjoying themselves back at the lodge. At this point, he was done with the game and just wanted to get back, so he called out to whoever was hiding behind the tree, saying he found them and to come back with him to the lodge. No reply came, but he wasn't going to wait for one. So he started back down the trail, but stopped when he heard a voice call out to him. "You almost had me." He ran back up to the tree to investigate, and when he shined his flashlight on it, he saw something out of a nightmare amongst the branches. It was extremely emaciated and stared at him with lifeless eyes. He distinctly remembers how the skin on its face and head was stretched, as if something was pulling it from behind. He screamed and started running for the lodge, dropping his flashlight in the process. As he ran, he was overcome by a pungent stench and could hear the monster running behind him. He found his cousins waiting for him near the lodge as he sprinted up, crying and shaking. They took him inside and he told his dad what he saw, but his cousins saw nothing chasing him. Their parents made them stay inside for the rest of the night. After his encounter, the OP didn't play any more games at night with his cousins and worried about them when they would not heed his warnings. He went years not knowing what he saw on that mountain, assuming because he was religious that it had been a demon. Then he heard of a video game called Until Dawn. It grew to popularity and he was watching gameplay on YouTube when the Wendigo in the game came on the screen. Chills ran down his spine and he knew exactly what he saw the night of his encounter. The creature behind the tree looked exactly like the one in the game. He did further research and this only cemented this fact to him. He also thinks back to the screech he heard in the tunnel. He hears an echo in his head from time to time and never thought the two were related. But now he isn't so sure. He again heard the horrific scream the night he posted his story. It's why he decided to share it. I've seen a picture of the Wendigo from Until Dawn. I'll put it up on the screen for you. It matches the description of the creature from the Native American folklore. It also matches other images I've seen. People often draw sketches of the beings they encounter. Others in subreddits draw them based off legend and lore and how they are described in the stories they read. The OP is 100% certain that is what he saw. The appearance and voice mimicking definitely match up. But I'll let you decide if you think that's what he encountered that night. The next story comes from a poster whose encounter took place in northeastern Ohio. He does not give an exact location. He has always been a skeptical person and has dismissed most cryptid stories and paranormal activity due to him not being able to find realistic reasoning behind the events that take place in the encounters he has read or heard. It was late summer, just before the original poster's junior year of high school. He was spending the night at his best friend's house. The yard backed up to a wooded area. It was a perfect night to sleep outdoors, so that is what they decided to do. But they would choose to do so without a tent and sleep on the ground in their sleeping bags. He describes the night air as inviting rather than humid and miserable. It was as close to perfect as you could get. There was a chorus of crickets filling the night with their chirping, frogs croaking, and other normal nightly sounds in the distance. The sky was so clear that night that the stars and the crescent moon fully illuminated the backyard. The mosquito count was lower than usual that year, so they had nothing to worry about. Or so they thought. Sometime during the night, the OP woke up with nature calling. So he went and did his business. But upon returning to his sleeping bag, he noticed that his friend wasn't in his. That's when he caught sight of his friend in his periphery and saw him standing beside the shed closest to the thickest part of the woods surrounding that part of the yard. The OP then noticed that it was eerily quiet. All the normal noises from crickets and other nocturnal animals had ceased. This caught him off guard, and when he looked over at his friend, he noticed that he was standing extremely still. Part of him was obscured as he stood slightly around the corner of the shed. He began making his way over to his friend to see what he was doing. He saw that he was not answering nature's call, so he continued over to him. The OP asked him what he was doing just standing there, circling around beside him, when he too froze in place, seeing what it was that had his friend's attention. Approximately 30 feet past the shed, beyond the tree line where the forest was thicker, stood the creature. The OP is 6 feet tall and says the creature was a few inches taller than him. It was bipedal and stood hunched over, with its head leaning forward. Its arms were long and lanky, with its forearms longer than its upper arms. It had sickly-looking hands with fingers that ended in claws. It was mostly standing in the shadows, but looked to have dark blue grayish skin. The head was mostly hidden behind the shadows, but resembled that of a human. He could not see a mouth or jaw on the creature, but what did stand out to him was this thing's eyes. They were red and looked to have a dim glow about them, illuminating its sunken eye sockets. He says they look like the red eye effect from old photos. It was exceptionally emaciated to the point that he knew it couldn't have been another person messing with him. Then it started moving. The OP found himself frozen where he stood, much like his friend, too afraid to move. The creature began bobbing up and down in an unnatural way, and he noticed flaps of skin hanging from the creature's arms. They were ragged and looked to have a fleshy texture, as if this thing had been flayed. The skin waved behind the creature as it bobbed, moving its arms up and down, like sick wings before takeoff. It began emanating a raspy, grating noise that echoed behind its breath as it inhaled. It was quiet yet terrifying, each breath digging further into your soul as you are helpless to resist. The OP and his friends stood and stared at the being for what felt like hours, but in reality it was less than 5 minutes. They both finally broke free of their fear-provoked paralysis and ran back to the house. They talked about what they saw and did some research, but never drew any sort of concrete conclusion to what they saw that night. One commenter told him he may have encountered a Wendigo, which prompted him to do some digging on that particular cryptid. One description he found, which describes what a Wendigo from Algonquin lore and legend looks like, without antlers and a skull face and head, he says looked exactly like what they saw that night. From what he describes, it seems to match the description of a Wendigo, and the movements it exhibited along with the sound it made makes me think it was trying to hypnotize them. He said they were frozen in fear, unable to move, and I've heard stories where cryptids can mess with people's heads. That's just the feeling I got when I was reading that part of the encounter. What do you think? The next story comes from a poster who is of Native American descent. He is well versed on folklore and legend, and he and his family believe many of these creatures, Wendigo, skinwalkers, and others, exist. He does not say where his encounter took place. He was 13 years old at the time and was on a 2-week family vacation, which was going fine until the last few days, when strange things began to happen. He does mention that there were some bad omens on their trip to the cabin where they would be staying. They saw dead birds during their drive, and his younger brother almost fell out of the moving vehicle due to a malfunction with the doors locked. During the final few days of the trip is when his encounter took place. Drawers, cabinets, and doors would be found open, and things like chairs and Tupperware would go missing. The family chalked it up to mischievous teens staying at one of the other campsites. But the OP says deep down they all knew something far more treacherous was going on. The happenings escalated into them hearing footsteps following them in the woods that would stop when they did, as well as feeling like they were being watched by something. They would also be hit with a rancid stench he describes as feces mixed with rotting meat that had been thrown into the fire. They would not be deterred from finishing their trip, however, as it had been a long time in the making. He recalls an event occurring one day before they left that had such a profound impact on him that it still haunts him to this day. He was walking through the woods gathering firewood when he noticed that the forest had fallen deathly silent. It was as if everything around him ceased to exist. The only things he heard was the pounding of his heart and the heavy footsteps approaching him. That's when he heard a raspy, chilling voice call out his name. It echoed all around him, seeming to come from in front and behind him at once. It resembled his sister's voice, but was harsh and animalistic. But his sister, who had left early, was no longer on the trip. He already knew whatever this was not his sister. It was something far more sinister. So he took off running for the campsite, with whatever was out there with him close in tow. He could hear sticks and leaves crunching behind him as he ran. When he reached the campsite, the footsteps suddenly stopped. When they left the next day, he looked into the woods and saw a tall, lanky figure just inside the tree line staring at him. It was gaunt and emaciated, its skin wrapped tightly around its bones. As the car rounded the corner, the creature vanished, seemingly into thin air. He later brought it up to his sister, and her face immediately went pale. Before she left, she said she saw a horrific, gaunt figure watching them from the riverbank. When it noticed that she had seen it, it ran off with inhuman speed. She had noticed long, deep scratch marks on the trail sign before she left, the very same trail this creature chased the OP down. He has not been back to that campsite since, and it was years before he would even consider going camping again. Given his and his sister's description of the cryptid, along with it mimicking his sister's voice, it sounds like a Wendigo. Again, he is Native American and knows lore and legend, so if he says it was a Wendigo, I'm more willing to believe that's what it was. Also, we have another example of this type of creature mimicking voices in a sinister manner. It's a good thing he picked up on the deception right away and ran back to the camp. It might have been the reason why he was able to escape. What do you think he and his sister saw on their vacation? The final story of this episode comes to us from Jack's River Trail in the Cohutta Wilderness located in northern Georgia. The Cohutta Wilderness spans an area of 36,977 acres, with 35,268 of those acres located in northern Georgia in the Chattahoochee National Forest. Approximately 1,709 acres of the Cohutta Wilderness are located in Tennessee in the Cherokee National Forest. Jack's River is the major geographical icon of the Cohutta Wilderness, spanning the length of the wilderness from the Dally Gap Trailhead in Blue Ridge, Georgia, to the Alacolce Valley Trailhead just across the Tennessee border. The Jack's River Trail spans 16.8 miles, the longest in the Cohutta Wilderness, and has 7 different trails that junction with it. The original poster and his friends set out down the Jack's River Trail to find a spot for a 2-day camping trip. Once they found their ideal location, they set up camp and spent the first day hiking the Jack's River and exploring the area. When night came, they built a fire, had dinner, and sat talking until a strange sound caught their attention. The OP was very familiar with the normal sounds of the forest, but this was not one of them. It was off. What they heard sounded like a group of people walking around their campsite in a stealthy manner to avoid being seen or heard. That's when things went from strange to bizarre. Both men took out their flashlights, shining them where they thought the noise was coming from. When they did, the sound would shift to a different part of the woods. They continued this, with the sound suddenly moving spots. Then the whistling started. The OP thought it was the wind at first, kicking up leaves and creating what they perceived as footsteps. His friend looked at him and asked if he heard the whistling too. He didn't answer, as he was trying to focus on each individual sound. The whistling consisted of 2 consecutive notes with a 3 to 4 second silence between. Then 2 more consecutive notes. This happened over and over. In that moment, the OP realized the feeling of terror that had come over him. His jaw was tight and he had his fists clenched. He instinctively knew he wasn't ready for what was out there. He sat and listened as the whistling continued for what seemed like an eternity. Finally, his friend yelled out, "Hey!" The whistling stopped. Silence engulfed the camp for a few minutes, but then the forest around them erupted with noise. Something started running through the woods, circling their camp. Then the whistling came back with the same pattern as before. 2 consecutive notes, a 3 to 4 second pause, then 2 more consecutive notes. The OP wondered how anyone could whistle perfectly like that without missing a note while running. This was it for him. He stood and tried to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there, shining his flashlight in all directions, but he saw nothing. He says what was running around their camp felt like it was close enough to touch, but they never saw it. The movement suddenly stopped, but the whistling persisted. It was extremely loud, inhumanly loud, the OP says. He told his friend to call the police as he started walking toward his tent. He had a large knife with a fixed blade in his bag and would feel more comfortable with it in hand. He reached his tent and started to unzip his bag, keeping a wary eye on the trees, when he heard something directly in front of him. He quickly pointed his flashlight forward and saw the thing terrorizing them. It was up in a tree. He describes everything about the creature as being long: its arms, legs, neck, and fingers. It also moved with inhuman speed, and as soon as the light was on it, the thing launched itself backward out of the tree and landed impossibly far away in a thicket. The OP yelled and ran back over to where his friend was sitting. His friend kept asking him what he saw, but he could not answer. He was still in shock, the image of the creature stuck in his head. They sat there for about 10 minutes before they saw flashlights approaching through the trees. 3 guys appeared and asked them if they were all right. The OP asked them if they had heard or seen anything. The men said they heard a lot of movement, and when they heard him scream, that's when they came over to see if everything was all right. The OP tried to tell them what he and his friend had been going through without sounding crazy, but he believes he failed at that. One of the guys looked around the area but didn't see anything. His friend told them that they called the police, and about 30 minutes later a park ranger arrived at their campsite. They told him everything, including seeing the creature. The ranger chalked it up to a curious animal or other campers trying to mess with them. The way he describes the whistling is like what I see and hear in a lot of other stories, where it is described as playing on a loop, perfectly done the exact same pitch and tone every time in such an unnatural way. Other storytellers usually describe it as mechanical, like a sound clip on repeat. He posted his story believing he and his friend encountered a Wendigo, which it definitely resembles based on his description and with its whistling. But it could also be a crawler, especially how it just kept running around their camp. I know some would say it couldn't be a Wendigo because of the location of the story, but I'm not willing to discount a certain type of cryptid based on location alone. If the description and behaviors fit the creature, then they fit no matter where the encounter took place. The thing they encountered definitely exhibited behavior that could be attributed to both of these cryptids, and without a better description of the creature, it's hard to say. I know the OP only saw it for a brief second though. What do you think they encountered that night? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocryedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.